She arrived on a Wednesday. I remember because Wednesday was my washing day, and I had just pulled the last sheet from the line when I heard the buggy turn into our drive. I did not recognize the horse. I stood there with that sheet bundled against my chest, still warm from the sun, and I watched a woman I had never seen in my life climb down from the seat and walk toward my front door like she already knew which step creaked. My husband, Jonas, met her at the door. He did not look at me. I was 31 years old. I had given birth 7 times in 11 years. My youngest was 4 months old and still nursing. My body had not fully belonged to me since the year I turned 20. And that Wednesday afternoon, standing in my own yard with my arms full of clean laundry, I understood for the first time that it never would again. Not the way I had imagined when I was a girl, not in any way I had a word for yet. Her name was Ruth. She was 24 years old. She would be living with us now, helping in the house, Jonas told me that evening at the supper table, his voice as measured as if he were telling me about a repair to the barn roof. He said it the way every decision had always been delivered in our home. Not as a question, not as a conversation, as a fact that had already been settled in a room I was never invited into, by a man who had not yet learned to wonder whether I might have something to say about the shape of my own life. I held my fork. I did not speak. Across the table, our oldest daughter watched my face. Stay with me. Because what I am about to tell you about what is permitted inside an Amish marriage when a wife's body has been given over to years, and children and labor is going to change the way you understand the word obedience. And if you grew up anywhere, that a man's decisions were treated like weather, something that simply arrived and had to be endured, you are going to recognize every word of this story. My name is Martha. I grew up Old Order Amish in Geauga County, Ohio. I left at 34 after 22 years inside a life that looked, from the road, exactly like a photograph on a calendar. Peaceful, purposeful, chosen. I am here on this channel, Hannah the Amish Girl, because the photograph lied. If you want to hear what was actually happening behind it, subscribe right now and tap the like button. It is free, and it means more to me than you know. And drop your country in the comments below. I read every single one, and where you are matters to me more than I can explain in this moment. Now let me tell you what it took me 3 years of therapy and 2 full years of distance to understand. What happened in my home the Wednesday Ruth arrived was not unusual. In my community it was not a scandal. It did not even have a name, because it did not need one. It was simply what happened when a wife could no longer carry the full weight of what the household required, and a husband decided the solution was to bring that weight inside on 2 younger legs. The theology of an Amish marriage is built on a structure so old it no longer needs to be spoken out loud. The first layer is headship. The husband is the head of the household the way Christ is the head of the church. His authority is not earned conversation by conversation, year by year. It is assumed. It is given at the altar, and it does not expire. Not for illness, not for exhaustion, not for 7 births, not for anything. The second layer is a wife's purpose. Her value is bound to her usefulness, and her usefulness is measured in meals and clean floors and children, always children, as many as God sends, which in practice means as many as her body can survive delivering. The third layer is the one nobody says out loud, but every woman in my community understood by the time she had given birth 3 times. A wife is not a person inside her marriage in the way the English world uses that word. She is a function, and when a function begins to slow, to show its strain, to need things the structure was never designed to give it, the answer is not to care for the function. The answer is to supplement it. Ruth was the supplement. I had been in labor with my 7th child, a boy we named Amish, for 31 hours. The midwife, a woman named Edna who had delivered half the children in our district, told Jonas quietly in the hallway after the birth that I should not have another pregnancy, that my body was showing signs of serious strain, the kind that accumulates and does not fully reverse, that some things cannot keep being asked of a woman without cost. I know she said this because my oldest daughter, 9 years old at the time, was standing in the dark hallway in her nightgown and heard every word. She told me 3 years later, when she was old enough to understand what she had overheard, and young enough to still believe that telling me would help somehow. Jonas never told me. Edna's warning moved through our household the way inconvenient truths always moved in our world. Sideways in silence, acknowledged by no one, and then quietly gone. 3 months after Amos was born, Ruth arrived with a single bag and a willingness to work that I could not fault and could not stop watching. I want to be exact about what her presence meant in practical terms, because this is where the story stops being about one woman in one house and becomes about something much larger. Ruth slept in the small room across the hall from our bedroom. She rose before me. She had the stove lit and the water heating before I came downstairs in the gray morning. She sat at my table for every meal. She answered my children when they called from the yard. She walked beside Jonas into the barn each evening to discuss the animals, and I watched from the kitchen window with Amos on my hip and flour on my hands, and I felt something I could not yet name. Not jealousy exactly, something older and colder than jealousy. The feeling of watching someone move through your own life while you stand outside it in the dark. Jonas told me Ruth was there to help, and she did help. That is the part that made it so difficult to name, so difficult to resist, so difficult even to feel clear about. When you are exhausted past the point where exhaustion has a floor, when you have not slept more than 4 hours together in 4 months, when your hands crack and bleed in the Ohio winters from the washing and your back has ached since the 6th pregnancy and never fully stopped, when you move through each day aware that your body is doing things it no longer has the resources to do, help is not nothing. Help is something you have been quietly dying for without knowing you were allowed to want it. And so I let her. I let her carry the bread to the table. I let her take Amos when he cried between feedings. I let myself sleep until 5:30 instead of 4. And I told myself this was sensible. This was what accepting grace looked like. I was not going to let this become about pride, hochmut. I had been taught my entire life that pride was the deepest sin, the one that rotted everything from the inside, and I was not going to let what I was feeling be named that. But then came the night I could not give that feeling any other name. I came downstairs for a glass of water, late, after Amos had finally settled. The kitchen was still lit. Jonas and Ruth were sitting at the table in the lamplight, not doing anything wrong, just talking. The way Jonas and I used to talk in the first 2 years of our marriage, before the children arrived so quickly there was no breath left over for conversation. His head was tilted toward her. She was laughing at something he had said. The lamp threw warm light across both their faces, and I stood in the doorway in my bare feet, and I understood something I had been refusing to understand for 3 months. This was not about help. Help does not make a man's shoulders drop like that. Help does not make his face open the way I had not seen his face open in years. Help does not make a wife feel like a visitor in the kitchen she has scrubbed every morning for 11 years. I went back upstairs without the water. I lay in the dark next to sleeping Amos, and I pressed my hand flat against the mattress, and I tried to remember the last time Jonas had laughed like that with me. Not performed a laugh, not made the sound of satisfaction at a good meal or a job done, but actually laughed, open and unguarded, and aimed at another person like a gift. I searched back through the years, through the harvests and the winters and the Sunday services and the pregnancies arriving one after another like seasons. I could not find the memory. It had been so long I could not locate it anywhere. That was the night I understood what had been taken from me. Not suddenly, not in one terrible moment of realization. Slowly, the way water takes a stone, year by year and pregnancy by pregnancy and need by need that was never acknowledged, never addressed, until I had been so quietly hollowed out that neither of us had noticed it happening. And now there was a 24-year-old woman downstairs laughing in the light I had built, and my husband was looking at her like something new, because she was new, and I was not. I was 11 years and 7 children and 31 hours of labor, and a body the midwife had quietly warned about in a hallway I was not standing in. I was the coat that had been worn through every season until the lining showed. Ruth was the one still folded on the shelf. There is a part of this story I cannot tell you here, not on this platform, not under these rules. The algorithm has limits, and I have learned exactly where they are. So I wrote the rest down instead, slowly, without the softening, without the cuts. Everything the camera is not permitted to show. The book is called The Ordnung They Never Wrote Down. 208 pages of what plain life looks like from the inside of it. The link is in the first comment of this video. That is where the part I could not say out loud lives. What I can tell you is what I did the week after that night. I went to the one person I trusted with things I could not carry alone. My mother's sister, my Aunt Miriam, who had been married for 37 years to a man I had watched make her small for every single one of them. She was the woman in my life who knew the most about surviving. I drove to her house alone, which was unusual enough that she understood something was wrong before I had said a word. I sat at her kitchen table and I told her everything. Ruth, the lamplight, the laughing, the doorway, the feeling of standing in my own home like someone who had arrived without an invitation. Miriam listened to all of it. She poured the tea. She set both hands flat on the table between us. And then she said the words I have thought about every single day since that afternoon. She said, "A wife who cannot give her husband what the house requires has to make room for someone who can." I held my teacup. I did not speak for a long time. The clock on her wall, the smell of her bread, her hands, cracked at the knuckles, flat on the table between us, completely still. I looked at her face and I saw my own face in 30 years if I stayed. Not as a warning she was offering me. As a description she believed in completely, without grief, without question. This was not going to change. This was not a crisis that would resolve. This was the plan. This was what the unspoken law that governed every breath in our community had always intended a wife to understand. A wife endures. A wife makes room. A wife does not call what is being done to her by the word it deserves, because there is no space in the theology for that word to exist. I drove home with my hands shaking the whole way. My friend Dorcas had lived through something similar. She was married at 19 to a good, serious man from a neighboring district, had 6 children in 8 years, and when her husband brought his widowed cousin into their home after her 4th pregnancy, Dorcas told me later she had felt almost nothing. She was so depleted that no feeling could find enough ground to stand on. She said she just moved through the house for 2 years, like a shadow, doing the work, tending the children, present in every room and invisible in all of them at once, including to herself. Then, one morning she woke before dawn and realized she had not cried in so long she genuinely could not remember the last time, and she understood that the part of her that was capable of feeling things had simply gone quiet in order to survive what was being asked of it. She told me this at a quilting bee, the week after I left our community, her voice completely level, the way you speak about weather. She was 33 years old. What happened to Dorcas, what happened to me, what was happening in house after house across our district in homes that looked from the road like simplicity and grace, was not a series of private misfortunes. It was a structure, a deliberately maintained outcome. A wife produces children until her body signals it cannot produce more. Her value inside the household is recalculated accordingly. The church says nothing. The ordained men say nothing. The Ordnung says nothing. What fills that silence is the assumption that a man's comfort and the needs of a man's house will always find their resolution, and the resolution will always arrive on 2 female legs, and the wife already present will understand that making room without complaint is the purest faithfulness she can still offer, since her body can no longer offer the other things. I left 11 months after Ruth arrived. I want to be precise about this because it matters. I did not leave because of Ruth. Ruth was 24 years old and she had been told her entire life, the same as I had been told mine, that her purpose was to fill whatever space a household required filling. She had not invented the system that brought her to my door. She was as much a product of it as I was, moving inside the only logic she had ever been given, doing what the community had trained her to understand as good and right and useful. She was not the cause of anything, she was a consequence, the same as I was. I left because of Miriam's hands flat on the table, because of Dorcas's voice at the quilting bee, because I finally understood that I was not experiencing a difficult marriage. I was experiencing a successful one, by every measure my community used to define success. And that was the understanding I could not survive remaining inside of. After the leaving, after the shunning settled in, and my mother's letters returned unopened and the Sunday mornings arrived with no service and no benches and no community to press my shoulder against, I eventually found a therapist named Susan. English, patient, careful with her words. In one of our early sessions I described the whole of it. Ruth, the lamplight, Miriam's words, the 11 years, the 7 births, the midwife's warning moving through the hallway like smoke. Susan listened to all of it without interrupting. Then she said, "You were erased incrementally. Each pregnancy, each year, each need of yours that went unasked and unanswered, a little more of you was made invisible, until enough of you had disappeared that there was room for someone else to step into the space you had occupied. Erased incrementally." I turned those 2 words over for weeks. They were the most precise description I had ever been given for what 11 years of Amish marriage had done to a woman who entered it at 20 with a complete self. I had not lost myself in one catastrophic moment. I had been unmade slowly, steadily, in a structure that gave the unmaking a different name, and called the name holy. I do not hold Jonas as a villain in this story. He did what his father had done, and his grandfather before that. He moved inside a structure that had never once required him to look at the woman across his table and ask what she needed. The structure did not demand cruelty. It only asked for compliance, and he gave it completely, the same as I had in the opposite direction. 2 people in the same house, moving further from each other inside a tradition that had mistaken distance for order and called it peace. The warm sheet is what I remember most. That Wednesday, that last ordinary moment before everything I understood about my life reorganized itself into a different shape. I pressed my face into the linen for just a second before I walked toward the house. That warmth, the simple warmth of cloth dried in October sun, is what I reach for when I need to remember who I was before I understood what was happening to me. A woman still capable of noticing small warmth. That woman was always worth more than the system she lived inside ever told her she was. The Amish world gave me things I will carry for the rest of my life, and I need you to hear me say that before I say what comes next. Community so deep it has a texture you can feel against your skin. A relationship with physical labor that has held me through every hard year since I left. Children who know how to be still. A faith that is genuinely broken in places, rebuilt differently from the pieces, and real in the way only a rebuilt thing can be. Not inherited, not performed, mine. I carry all of that. I will always carry it. But there is no scripture that requires a woman's value to expire alongside her youth. There is no passage in any text I was ever handed that consecrates a wife's invisibility as holy. There is no God I believe in now who watched a woman press her face into warm laundry on a Wednesday morning and decided she deserved to be made a ghost in her own kitchen. The theology I was given said that suffering was faithfulness. I am here to tell you that suffering was just suffering. And faithfulness, the real kind, the kind that asks something true of you, looks nothing like disappearing. If you were made to shrink to make room for someone else's comfort, I see you. If you gave your body and your years and your mornings to a life that never once turned around and asked what you needed in return, I see you. If a decision was ever handed to you across a table like a weather report, with no room for your voice anywhere inside it, I see you. Your comfort matters. Your body matters. Your experience of your own life, every part of it, including the parts the system told you to be quiet about, matters. That was never a small thing. It was always the whole thing. Leave me a comment. Tell me what surprised you. Tell me if any part of this story sounds like something you knew from the inside. Tell me where you are watching from. And if you want to keep hearing what they never permitted us to say out loud, subscribe to Hannah the Amish Girl. I have so many more truths waiting behind this camera, and not one of them has been easy to say, and every single one of them is worth saying. If you want to read the version of this story that YouTube will not allow, the full pages are in the Ordnung they never wrote down. First comment of this video. And that is everything. Choose your freedoms wisely. They might just save your life.